I was 68 years old when I finally admitted to myself that my parents had never seen me as more than the family's unpaid servant. To Cornelius and Maura Rowan, I was steady Althea, the practical one, the girl who never made waves. They saved their pride and praise for my younger siblings. Leander was the golden boy, born with a smile that opened doors, and Celine sparkled so brightly that my parents swore entire rooms revolved around her. I was the shadow behind them, expected to set the table, wash the dishes, and keep quiet. Our Connecticut home had always felt like a stage. My parents wanted society to see wealth, charm, and promise. I was the stagehand, dressed in plain clothes, pulling ropes behind the curtains so that their favored children could shine in the spotlight. By the time I was a teenager, the role fit like a second skin. I stopped asking for recognition and learned to work in silence. But silence is not the same as surrender. At 19, I was scrubbing floors in a midtown Manhattan hotel when fate handed me an unexpected gift. His name was Aurelio Vassos, an aging Greek businessman who stayed in the same suite for nearly 3 months. He noticed me one morning when I carried his breakfast tray, and instead of treating me like part of the wallpaper, he asked my name. Every day afterward, he asked more: what books I read, what I dreamed about, whether I believed a woman could build her own fortune in a world that didn't want her to. I answered honestly, though I never expected him to remember my words. Yet he did. When Aurelio died the following spring, a lawyer came to the hotel with an envelope. Inside was a letter in his shaky hand, and a legal document that startled me more than anything I had ever seen. He had left me a sliver of his company, just a handful of shares in a shipping firm I had only vaguely heard of. I told no one. Not my parents. Not Leander. Not Celine. I tucked the documents into a tin box beneath my bed and returned to work the next morning as if nothing had changed. Still, I knew something had. That seed, planted in secrecy, grew quietly for decades while my family insisted I was unambitious, invisible, useful only when serving. And now, so many years later, that secret was about to be tested in ways they could never imagine. Beginning with a single phone call from my mother. The phone rang just after dawn, the shrill tone cutting through the quiet of my Manhattan apartment. I didn't need to check the caller ID. Only my mother called at hours like this, as if the world existed on her schedule alone. "Althea," Maura said, skipping any greeting. "Christmas Eve dinner. We need you here tomorrow." Her voice carried the brittle command of someone who had never learned to ask. I pressed the phone to my ear, staring at the tidy rows of notes in my calendar. Florida was circled in red ink, an investor meeting that could anchor my company's next expansion. What sort of dinner, I asked, though I already knew the answer. "For 25, she said. "Executives, society friends." Celine's arranged for Draven Calder himself to attend. "You'll arrive by noon to begin preparations. 7 dishes, 10 sides. Use the silver." She recited it as though reading from scripture. My pulse stayed steady. Calder. Of all people, I knew him well enough already, though not in the way my mother imagined. Still, I let her continue, her words scraping against the edges of old wounds. "Celine will need everything perfect," she added. "This is her chance. Don't embarrass us with anything rustic." I almost laughed, but the sound would have come out sharp. "And what will Leander be doing?" I asked. "Entertaining guests. Of course. You've always been more comfortable in the kitchen." It was the same script I had heard for half a century, only now the lines felt thinner, almost transparent. I closed my notebook slowly, running a finger along the embossed cover. Florida, the boardroom, the future. "I have plans," I said, careful to keep my tone even. "Nonsense," she snapped. "What plans could be more important than family? You don't refuse." when your family needs you. I looked around my apartment, filled with the quiet proof of a life built by my own hand artwork, collected over years. Books lined in careful order, files that marked the growth of something my parents had never even tried to see. Her voice still rang through the line, but my mind was already elsewhere. The choice was no longer between cooking or not cooking. It was between continuing to live in their story or finally claiming my own, and that choice was no choice at all. When I was 17, a thick envelope arrived in the mail with my name on it. Cornell had offered me a scholarship partial, but enough to make the impossible suddenly real. I remember holding that letter in trembling hands, imagining a life where I could study economics, sit in libraries that smelled of oak and old paper, and maybe, just maybe, become more than the shadow my family cast over me. But at dinner that night, my father folded the letter neatly and slid it back across the table. "Leander has been accepted too," he said, his voice firm. "Our savings will go to him. He'll make the family proud. You'll be fine anywhere." I looked to my mother, hoping for some flicker of fairness, but she only patted my hand and said, "You've always been resourceful. Althea, you'll manage." That was the end of it. My future. Traded away with a shrug. So Leander went to Cornell in pressed blazers, his tuition paid in full, while I stayed behind, taking shifts at a dry cleaner and helping my mother prepare meals for his triumphant returns home. I swallowed my anger, turned it into silence, and learned to survive on less. The pattern only deepened over the years. When Celine became engaged, my parents insisted her wedding had to be an event worthy of the Rowans. They raided the modest savings account I had scraped together from endless overtime, never asking, only informing me afterward. "Your sister deserves a proper start," my father said. I stood outside the ballroom that night, watching Celine whirl in her designer gown, knowing she was dancing on the ashes of my effort. And yet, while they celebrated themselves, I learned something they never did. Discipline. Frugality. I took what little remained from Aurelio's gift and placed it carefully into reinvestments. I tracked every dollar, every dividend, until I could turn scarcity into growth. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but what they gave me instead was steel in my bones. Decades of servitude shaped me. Yes, but they also forged a quiet strength, and that strength was no longer content to stay silent. Especially as Christmas Eve drew closer, and my mother's voice still rang in my ears. On the 30th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, my name didn't appear on the door, but my presence filled every corner. Ardentia Group, my company, though you'd never know it from the paperwork, hummed with the low rhythm of phones, keyboards, and ambition. 40 employees across 3 cities, contracts in hospitality and event management. And yet, to my family, I was still the girl who set the table. I chose the invisibility on purpose. The articles of incorporation listed a trust, not my name. Public filings showed only my COO, Inez Moreno, as the point of contact. It was easier that way. Cleaner. If the Rowans ever stumbled upon Ardentia's name, they would pass right over it, never imagining I had built it from nothing. In the office, though, I was never invisible. Morning, Mid Rowan. My staff greeted me with genuine respect as I walked past glass-walled conference rooms. Their deference always startled me a little, like hearing my own name spoken in a foreign language. At home, Althea was muttered only when someone needed another dish washed or another errand run. Here, it carried weight. Inez knocked lightly on my door that afternoon, a tablet in her hand. "The Florida contract's nearly locked," she said. "They want you at the table for final signatures. Calder himself will be there. Draven Calder." The name alone made my chest tighten. I pictured my mother's voice bragging about his attendance at Celine's party, certain he was her daughter's gateway to prestige. They had no idea he was already mine. Inez studied me for a moment, her sharp eyes catching more than I wished. "Your family has no idea who you really are," she said softly. "One day, it'll blow up." I only smiled, faintly. Let it. Because part of me, the part that had been silenced and belittled for decades, wanted the truth to burst open like a firework. Not by my hand, but by fate's timing. And fate, I suspected, was already arranging the pieces, placing Calder at both my boardroom table and my parents' Christmas Eve dinner. The collision was inevitable, and I could almost feel the tremor of it in my bones as I looked at the calendar and saw the date circle tightening. The drive up to Connecticut was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against my ribs. Frost clung to the roadside trees, sparkling in the pale morning light, but my thoughts were heavier than the winter air. When I turned onto the familiar street, the old Rowan estate came into view. From the outside, it still looked stately white columns, manicured hedges, stone lions at the gate. Yet as I parked and stepped inside, the illusion frayed. The wallpaper was faded, the carpets threadbare, and the air carried the stale scent of furniture polish, masking decay. My parents stood at the entrance hall, as if greeting visiting royalty. Mora's eyes flicked over me, lingering on my coat and shoes. "Don't embarrass us, Althea," she said coolly. "Wear something plain. You're not the star of tonight." Celine swept in from the parlor, draped in crimson silk that shimmered with each step. "Draven Calder will be here," she announced as though conjuring magic. "This is the night that matters." Leander trailed behind, sipping brandy though it was barely noon. His gaze slid toward the driveway. "You still driving that old car?" "How quaint." His smirk stung less than it used to. Age had dulled his bite, though not his arrogance. Guests were already milling about the foyer, balancing champagne flutes. My mother reached behind a sideboard and pulled out a starched white apron. Without hesitation, she held it up and smiled to the crowd. "Our reliable helper," she declared, slipping the strings toward me. "Althea always saves the day." The room's chatter dimmed as faces turned in curiosity. I looked at the apron, then at my mother. Slowly, I folded the cloth in half, then again. Pressing it neatly into a square, I set it on the sideboard and stepped back. A quiet resolve settled over me, firmer than any words I might have spoken. For years I had carried their commands like chains. But not tonight, because tonight, the chains would fall and the truth would walk in with them. By evening, the estate buzzed with forced laughter and the clink of crystal. My parents had polished every surface that still gleamed, desperate to disguise the wear. Guests filled the parlor and dining room, their conversations circling wealth, contracts, and influence. Celine moved among them with theatrical grace, her bracelets chiming as if punctuating her importance. Then he arrived, Draven Calder, tall and composed, the sort of man whose presence pulled a room taut. My parents nearly tripped over themselves to greet him. "This is Celine," Mora gushed, pressing a hand to her daughter's back. "She's our jewel, brilliant in public relations. So talented. You'll be impressed." I stood near the sideboard, unnoticed, as always. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, her smile tightening. She pressed a tray of wine glasses into my hands. "Serve these," she hissed. "Impress him with your cooking later. At least you can do that much." I steadied the tray, but before I moved, Calder's gaze swept the room. It landed on me and stopped. For a long heartbeat, his expression froze. Then his mouth curved into a knowing smile. "Miss Rowan," he said, stepping forward, his voice carrying easily over the hum of conversation. "Boss." I didn't expect to see you here. The tray in my hands trembled slightly. But it was the room that shook. Gasps rippled across the table. Celine stumbled mid-step, color draining from her face. My father's glass paused halfway to his lips. Maura blinked as if she'd misheard. Calder reached for a glass from my tray. Still smiling. "Ladies and gentlemen," he continued, raising it slightly, "may I introduce the founder of Ardentia Group, a visionary leader and one of the sharpest minds I've worked with. Her company has set a new standard in our industry." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint chime of Celine's bracelets as her hand shook. For the first time in my life, the air in that house bent toward me, and every eye that had once looked past me now struggled to meet my gaze. Calder's words did not stop with his toast. He set his glass down, folded his hands as though we were in a boardroom rather than a dining room, and said, "Ardentia has just finalized a multi-million-dollar expansion with my firm. It's one of the most ambitious partnerships I've had the privilege to sign in years, and I have Ms. Rowan to thank for her professionalism and vision." The air seemed to thin. Conversations that had once fluttered with easy arrogance now shrank into whispers. I caught the hiss of Celine's bracelets again as she tried to lift her fork, her hand shaking too much to guide it. The glossy speech she had prepared about her own talents dissolved before she could open her mouth. Maura leaned forward, her voice faltering. "Well, of course. Althea never told us any of this. We would have supported her, had we known." Calder tilted his head, his eyes glittering with something like amusement. "Funny," he said, his tone light but sharp. "You never asked." Cornelius cleared his throat, shifting in his chair as though the room had suddenly turned hostile. "She has always been private." A ripple of laughter spread among the guests. But it wasn't kind. It was the kind that slips out when a lie finally crumbles under its own weight. They were seeing what I had lived all my life, the proud Rowans. Scrambling, I set my glass down gently, my reflection trembling in the dark wine. When I finally spoke, my voice carried farther than I expected. "For years, I was your maid. You dressed me in aprons and called me reliable because it served you to keep me small. Tonight, I am only myself." The words cut cleanly, leaving silence in their wake. No one rushed to fill it. Celine lowered her eyes. Leander, for once, had no smirk to offer. And my parents, who had built their reputation on polished lies, sat exposed under the harshest light of all truth. Calder nodded once in quiet acknowledgement, then turned back to his meal, as though the matter were settled. But for me, it was only beginning, and I could feel the fault lines spreading beneath the fragile ground of my family's pride. It did not take long for the story to travel. Connecticut's circles thrived on whispers, and soon every dining room and country club carried the tale the Rowans, once so quick to flaunt their refinement, had paraded their own daughter as a maid in front of the very man whose empire she now partnered with. The irony was too rich to resist. Celine's carefully curated list of clients began to shrink within weeks. No one wanted their brand tied to someone who couldn't even read her own family correctly. Leander fared no better. A few of his long-standing clients withdrew, muttering about reputational risk. Maura and Cornelius, stripped of their air of superiority, quietly recused themselves from charity boards where their names had once carried weight. What had been their pride became their ruin. I, on the other hand, stepped into light that felt almost blinding. Forbes placed me on the cover, their headline unflinching Althea Rowan, the quiet architect of Ardentia. My employees crowded the office lobby the morning it hit stands, cheering as though the victory was theirs too. In truth, it was. Calder called within days. offering introductions that opened doors I had only glimpsed from afar. Then came the invitation that made me pause. Cornell University asked me to deliver the keynote at their entrepreneurship forum. The very place I had once been denied now wanted me at its podium. I folded the letter carefully, feeling the arc of time close in on itself. It was around then that my parents asked to see me. Their voices on the phone were subdued, stripped of authority. They spoke of reconciliation, of misunderstandings. I listened, then set my conditions equal respect. An apology not whispered, but spoken. Therapy to confront the years they had buried. Above all, I told them, there would be no return to aprons or commands. If they wanted a daughter, they would meet me as one, not as their servant. The silence on the line stretched long, but I felt no urge to fill it. I had waited a lifetime for this balance, and I would not bend now as the table began to turn toward me. Spring had settled over Manhattan when I finally opened my home for a dinner of my own choosing. My apartment glowed in warm light. The long table set with care by people who respected me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The guests who filled the seats were not blood, but kin of a different kind. Friends who had stood beside me, colleagues who had built Ardentia with me, and a few young women I had chosen to mentor. When the first course arrived, it was my staff who carried the plates. I remained at the head of the table, no apron around my waist, no commands pulling me to and fro. Conversation bubbled with laughter, ideas, and plans for the future. Here, my presence was not tolerated, but celebrated. I raised my glass and saw my reflection in theirs, equal, visible, whole. My parents' chairs remained empty, by my choice as much as theirs. A letter from Celine had arrived earlier that week. Carefully worded, tentative in tone. She asked if we might speak, perhaps share a meal. I folded it neatly and placed it in my desk drawer. It would wait until I was ready. If that day ever came, as dessert was served, I looked around the table I had built from nothing but grit, and silence turned into steel. The irony struck me with a quiet smile. I was never just their maid. I was always my own boss. Respect, I had learned, is not negotiable. If those who once called me servant now beg for a seat, would I open my table or keep it set only for respect?